The cold steel of a pistol was pressed firmly against my temple before my boots even cleared the transport plane's ramp. On the rain-slicked tarmac, my second-in-command lay gasping in a pool of his own blood, forced to his knees by 3 military policemen while Colonel Richard Briggs held a loaded weapon to my head. "You are relieved of command, stripped of rank, and under arrest for high treason, Hayes," Briggs said, his voice dripping with absolute malice. 6 hours ago, he had deliberately denied my squad an emergency medical evacuation in Syria, leaving 14 men to be slaughtered in a mortar pit just to protect his clean operational record. To save their lives, I bypassed his command node and forced an unauthorized extraction, a move that saved my team, but handed Briggs the exact weapon he needed to destroy me. "If you make one sound, Evelyn, you'll be shot as an enemy combatant right here on this runway," he whispered into my ear, tightening his finger on the trigger. I looked at my bleeding men, then straight into the eyes of the coward holding the gun, knowing that if I survived the next 10 seconds, I was going to tear his entire world apart. They dragged me toward the base perimeter gate under heavy armed escort, dropping me onto the muddy shoulder of the highway just outside the security checkpoints. The heavy steel gates slammed shut behind me, the mechanical lock sliding into place with a hollow, echoing clank that sounded like a coffin lid closing. I stood there alone in the pouring rain, stripped of my sidearm, my military identification, and my unit insignia, with blood still soaking through the makeshift bandage on my left shoulder. To anyone driving past on the highway, I was just a discarded, broken civilian standing in the storm, but behind my eyes, a cold, calculated fire was beginning to burn. I walked 3 miles down the rain-slicked secondary road to a run-down motel nestled between a truck stop and a pine forest. The cheap room smelled of damp carpet and stale tobacco, illuminated only by the flickering neon sign outside the window. I didn't waste a second feeling sorry for myself or staring at the bruises in the cracked bathroom mirror. I unzipped the false lining of my civilian travel bag, pulling out a heavily encrypted biometric satellite terminal, a piece of custom hardware I had kept hidden from military eyes throughout my deployment. My fingers were trembling from blood loss and exhaustion as I pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner. The screen flashed a sharp green, initializing an encrypted channel directly to a private server in Virginia. Before I enlisted 3 years ago as a point man looking for a purpose beyond boardroom politics, I had spent 5 years working as a senior risk analyst for a private defense contractor, quietly mastering the complex legal networks, logistics protocols, and bureaucratic frameworks that governed military operations. I didn't need a corporate empire or an army of private gunships to destroy Richard Briggs. I just needed to find the one flaw in his bulletproof narrative. My screen illuminated with a video link to Thomas, a former military prosecutor who now ran an independent veteran advocacy firm in Washington. His face turned pale as he took in my blood-soaked uniform and the cuts across my jaw. "Evelyn, what happened out there?" Thomas asked, his voice sharp with immediate concern. "We saw the emergency beacon ping 3 hours ago, but the official base log says your squad was detained for operational misconduct." "Briggs set a trap," I said, my voice steady despite the intense throbbing in my shoulder. "He denied our emergency medical evacuation in Syria to protect his readiness metrics, leaving 14 men pinned in a kill zone. When I bypassed his command node to pull my team out, he classified it as an unauthorized desertion under fire. He disarmed me at gunpoint on the runway, confiscated my team's sidearms, and placed the entire squad under strict isolation in the base holding cells to keep them from talking." Thomas leaned closer to his camera, his expression hardening into intense anger. "He's insulating himself, Evelyn. I just pulled the initial filings from the Judge Advocate General's office. Briggs filed a formal report 3 hours ago claiming you panicked under fire, disobeyed a direct order to hold your position, and forced a rogue extraction that endangered your men. He has 3 senior staff officers who signed off on his timeline. It's his word against a disgraced commander, and he's already scrubbing the server logs at Camp McCall. Then we need the raw satellite telemetry from the Syrian sector," I replied, my fingers moving rapidly across the terminal keyboard. The primary command center routes all voice transmissions through an automated backup relay managed by the Joint Operations Center in Qatar. Briggs thinks he deleted the localized logs from his office console, but he doesn't have the authority to purge the secondary server in Doha. Thomas shook his head, his tone laced with heavy hesitation. You can't just request those logs, Evelyn. You've been officially stripped of your security clearance and relieved of command. The moment I file a formal subpoena for those audio files without an active military sponsor, the Pentagon's legal office will freeze the request for 60 days. By the time that review finishes, Briggs will have court-martialed your men, manufactured their statements under duress, and sealed your file forever. I leaned back against the rickety chair, feeling the room tilt slightly as shock and blood loss threatened to pull me under. Briggs knew the bureaucracy better than I thought. He hadn't just relied on brute force on the tarmac. He had built an ironclad legal cage around my squad before the transport plane had even touched down. If I couldn't access the primary audio files, and my men were locked in solitary confinement without legal representation, I had no physical proof that the evacuation request was ever made. Suddenly, the screen on my terminal flashed a bright yellow warning banner. Unauthorized breach detected. Local sector. I stood up, my hand instinctively reaching for a sidearm that was no longer on my hip. Outside the motel window, through the heavy sheets of rain, 2 dark civilian SUVs pulled into the gravel parking lot, their headlights cutting through the darkness directly toward my room number. The doors opened, and 4 men in heavy tactical coats stepped out, their hands concealed inside their pockets as they moved into a flanking formation around my door. Briggs wasn't just trying to cover his tracks in court. He had sent a team to make sure I never made it to Washington. I killed the lights in the motel room, plunging myself into absolute darkness before the first kick hit the door frame. The wooden door shattered inward with a loud crack, the wet gravel crunching under heavy tactical boots as 2 men moved into the entryway, their suppressed weapons raised to sweep the room. Moving purely on instinct honed by 3 years of close-quarters combat, I dropped low beneath the window frame, grabbed the heavy iron desk chair, and swung it with everything I had into the legs of the lead operator. He stumbled forward with a grunt, his gun frame clattering against the nightstand as he went down. I grabbed his wrist, twisting the suppressed sidearm from his grip, and drove my elbow directly into his nose before scrambling backward through the open bathroom window into the freezing rain of the rear alleyway. I ran through the slick mud of the pine forest behind the truck stop, my chest burning, holding the stolen weapon tightly against my ribs. Briggs had escalated this from a cover-up to an active execution. He knew that if I stayed alive for another 12 hours, I would find a way to break his narrative. So he was treating me like a threat that needed to be eliminated before sunrise. I didn't head for the highway or try to reach Washington. Instead, I circled around the perimeter of the base, using the thick tree line and memory of the terrain to reach the eastern fence line near the old supply depot, a blind spot in the base security camera grid that I had noted during an inspection months ago. Using a pair of wire cutters pulled from the tactical vest of the operator I had knocked down, I cut through the chain-link mesh and slipped back onto the military installation. I wasn't running anymore. To beat Briggs, I had to get inside his own house and take the evidence directly from his personal server before he could permanently overwrite it. I bypassed the main barracks, staying in the deep shadows of the motor pool, and made my way to the rear entrance of the base communications facility. The building was guarded by 2 young sentries who looked more exhausted than alert. I slipped through the basement maintenance access, picking the lock on the server room door with a piece of steel wire. Inside the climate-controlled hum of the primary data hub, my fingers flew across the maintenance console. Briggs had indeed purged the localized audio logs from the primary dispatch queue, but he had made one critical mistake. He forgot about the automated local hardware cache that backs up every internal radio call onto an unformatted solid-state drive every 24 hours. I plugged my encrypted terminal directly into the raw data port, watching the progress bar tick slowly upward as the raw, unedited audio files transferred. 0%, 34%, 78%. Just as the transfer hit 99%, the heavy steel door behind me clicked, and the lights flooded the room. "Turn around slowly, Evelyn," a smooth, composed voice said from the doorway. I turned my head. Standing there wasn't an enraged, shouting Colonel Briggs. It was Captain Reynolds, the base executive officer and Briggs's right-hand strategist, holding an M9 pistol leveled directly at my chest with complete, unwavering precision. "I knew you'd come here, Evelyn," Reynolds said, his voice terrifyingly calm as he stepped into the room, revealing 3 armed security officers behind him. "You're predictable. You always think the truth will save you. But Colonel Briggs already signed the transfer orders for your squad 2 hours ago. They aren't in the holding cells anymore. They're being moved to a high-security detention facility in Kansas right now under heavy sedation for operational trauma." My blood ran cold. My men were being scattered, isolated, and silenced before I could even present the evidence. "Hand over the drive, Evelyn," Reynolds ordered, extending his hand. "You lost this game the moment you stepped off that plane." I stared at the barrel of Captain Reynolds's M9, feeling the cold condensation of the server room air settle against my neck. My fingers remained rested near the terminal console behind my back, where the transfer light was blinking its final, steady green. "You think you've buried them, Reynolds," I said, keeping my voice utterly level as I stepped away from the server rack to draw his eyes off the terminal. "But you can't erase a paper trail that isn't running on military servers." Reynolds chuckled softly, a controlled, condescending sound. "You still don't understand how this works, Evelyn. There is no paper trail without a living witness or a commander to submit it. By midnight, your squad will be signed into psychiatric hold at Leavenworth, classified under severe post-traumatic stress, their testimony rendered legally inadmissible. And as for you broke onto a federal installation, stole military hardware, and resisted arrest." He didn't need to finish the sentence. "A rogue officer shot while breaking into a classified communications center during a security lockdown wouldn't raise a single question in Washington. Briggs had calculated every variable, using the rigidity of the military system to insulate his crime. "Lower the weapon, Captain," a heavy, authoritative voice rang out from the doorway behind him. Reynolds froze, his eyes widening slightly as he turned his head without dropping his aim. Standing at the entrance of the server facility was Colonel Vance, the regional commander of the Military Criminal Investigation Division, flanked by 4 heavily armed NCIS special agents with their badges displayed around their necks. "Put the sidearm on the floor, Reynolds," Vance repeated, his face carved from granite as he stepped into the room. "Right now." "Sir, this is an unauthorized intruder," Reynolds began, his composure finally cracking. I didn't wait for him to finish his lie. I reached behind my back, pulled the encrypted terminal drive from the server port, and tossed it straight into Colonel Vance's hands. "Check the hardware cache timestamp, Colonel," I said, looking Reynolds straight in the eye. "That drive contains the unredacted automated audio logs from Syria. It records Colonel Briggs explicitly denying our medical evacuation, followed immediately by Captain Reynolds logging into the local terminal at 0200 hours to manually erase the dispatch record." Vance snapped the drive into a portable reader carried by the agent beside him. Within 10 seconds, the room was filled with the clear, crackling audio of my own desperate voice, begging for an air ambulance for Sergeant Miller, followed by Briggs's cold, unmistakable response, calling my team an acceptable statistical loss. Reynolds's face drained of color as the agents moved in, snatching his weapon from his hand and forcing his arms behind his back in a single fluid motion. "Secure the captain," Vance ordered, turning his gaze toward me with a slow, solemn nod. "And halt the transport convoy on the perimeter road. Get those men to the regional medical center immediately." 10 minutes later, the heavy iron gates of the base opened not for my exile, but for the arrival of 3 CID staff vehicles pulling up to headquarters. I walked onto the main runway alongside Colonel Vance, just as 2 military police officers escorted Colonel Richard Briggs down the front steps of his office in steel handcuffs. He wasn't screaming or making grand speeches. His hands were trembling, his eyes darting frantically across the tarmac as he realized that every layer of his bureaucratic armor had been dismantled by the very rules he had tried to weaponize. I didn't mock him as he was loaded into the rear of the transport car. I stood silently in the rain, watching the vehicle pull away toward the federal detention facility, feeling the bitter knot of anger in my chest resolve into something calm and unbreakable. An hour later, I stood in the quiet recovery ward of the base hospital. Sergeant Miller was propped up in his bed, a fresh IV line hooked to his arm and his breathing steady, surrounded by the rest of Gold Squadron. As I walked into the room, every one of my men stood as straight as their injuries would allow, their eyes filled with an absolute, unshakable respect. The fight had nearly cost me everything, my rank, my freedom, and my life. But as I stood among the people who had trusted me in the darkest corners of the world, I knew I had won the only battle that truly mattered. I had protected my team, held the line for my dignity, and proved that no rank or authority can ever extinguish the truth. The morning sun finally broke through the heavy rain clouds, casting long golden rays across the damp hospital floor. Sitting in the quiet room beside my men, the constant noise of sirens, helicopter rotors, and shouting commanders felt a million miles away. General Vance walked into the ward an hour later, holding a folder containing the official documentation from the Inspector General's office. Every false charge against me had been permanently struck from the record. My command status was fully restored, and Colonel Briggs, along with Captain Reynolds, was facing formal court-martial charges under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. "You brought them all back, Commander," Vance said softly, offering a crisp salute before leaving us alone. "And you held the line when the system failed you." I looked down at the worn silver coin in my palm, the $50 my grandfather had given me, and slipped it into my pocket. I hadn't needed a corporate empire, a fleet of gunships, or dirty political tricks to win this war. I had relied on the truth, quiet discipline, and an unyielding commitment to the people who depended on me. Miller looked up from his hospital bed, a faint smile on his pale face. "What's the next move, Commander?" I looked around the room at the 14 men who had trusted me through hell and back. The doubts, the laughter in the barracks, and the endless fight to prove my worth as a woman in this world had all faded into the past, leaving behind an unbreakable sense of inner peace and dignity. "We rest," I said, a calm, steady smile finally touching my lips. "And then, we get back to work." The quiet hum of the hospital monitors faded into the background as I sat beside Miller's bed, my mind drifting back 6 days prior to the sun-scorched dirt of Sector 7 in Al-Hasaka. To truly understand why Briggs's betrayal cut so deep, you have to understand what happened in that ruined courtyard before the transport plane ever brought us home. It was 1400 hours when the trap snapped shut. My squad had been tasked with a routine reconnaissance sweep near an abandoned agricultural facility 3 miles outside the village. Intelligence from command had assured us the sector was completely clear, but as soon as our lead vehicle crossed the dry riverbed, the hills surrounding us lit up with heavy machine gun fire. A RPG tore through the engine block of our lead vehicle, showering the alleyway with white-hot shrapnel and pinning us inside a crumbling stone compound with zero cover behind us. "Ambush! Left flank!" Miller had screamed, dragging a wounded team member behind a low mud brick wall as enemy rounds chewed through the masonry above our heads. I dropped behind a collapsed archway, my cheek pressed against the stock of my rifle, taking steady breaths to force my heart rate down. Through my optic, I could see at least 30 armed insurgents closing in from 3 directions, establishing a textbook flanking maneuver designed to compress us into the center of the yard, where their mortar team could finish us off. "Gold Actual! This is Gold 1!" I barked into my tactical headset, adjusting my frequency to the direct command relay at Camp McCall. "We are pinned in Sector 7. Heavy small arms fire and incoming 82mm mortars, requesting immediate close air support or an emergency medical bird. How copy?" The static crackled over the line, and then came Colonel Briggs's voice. Cool, detached, and entirely devoid of urgency. "Gold Actual. Be advised, your request for air support is denied. Satellite imagery shows a storm front moving into your sector. Risk to aviation assets is unacceptably high. You are ordered to hold your position and break contact on foot. I looked up at the sky. There was not a single cloud in sight. The sun was beating down with brutal intensity, baking the Syrian dust into our sweat. It was a complete, blatant lie. Briggs knew that sending a chopper into a hot drop zone would look bad on his quarterly readiness report if an aircraft sustained damage, so he was willing to let 14 men get wiped out in a courtyard to protect his command statistics. "There is no storm, Colonel," I yelled into the mic over the deafening roar of a mortar shell exploding 30 yards away. "We have 2 critically wounded. If you don't send the birds right now, my men will be dead in 15 minutes. "Watch your tone, Commander," Briggs replied, his voice chillingly calm. "The loss of a team in an unvetted sector is an acceptable statistical risk compared to losing a multi-million-dollar airframe. Deal with it yourself. McCall out." The line went dead. In that single, terrifying second, the illusion of the military hierarchy shattered. I realized that no one was coming to save us. The system we had sworn to serve had written us off as acceptable collateral damage. The men looked at me, their faces covered in soot and sweat, waiting for an order from the woman they had been told was too soft to lead them in a real fight. "Commander, what are the orders?" Miller asked, his hands trembling slightly as he reloaded his weapon. "We save ourselves," I said, a strange, absolute clarity settling over my mind. I pulled out my personal satellite terminal, bypassing the base frequency entirely, and dialed the direct line to a private contractor team operating 5 miles to our west. I didn't beg, and I didn't hesitate. I gave them exact grid coordinates, offered my personal guarantee for the fuel costs, and called in a favor that saved every single man in that courtyard. We fought our way out inch by inch, laying down a wall of suppressive fire, carrying our wounded through the mud and smoke until the private gunships touched down to lift us out of the hellhole Briggs had left us in. Now, sitting in the warm morning light of the base hospital room, watching the sun reflect off the pristine floorboards, the memory of that dust and blood felt like a distant nightmare. The door to the ward opened, and Colonel Vance stepped back inside, holding a crisp manila envelope stamped with the official seal of the Department of the Navy. He walked over to my chair and handed me the document. "This came directly from the Chief of Naval Operations 10 minutes ago," Vance said, his voice quiet with deep respect. "Your command has been officially reinstated. Your squad is being awarded the Navy Unit Commendation for extraordinary heroism, and Colonel Briggs's court-martial has been scheduled for next month. He will spend the rest of his life in a federal penitentiary." I looked at the document, then handed it to Miller, who passed it around the room to the rest of the squad. There were no loud cheers or wild celebrations, just a deep, collective exhale from 14 men who had finally been brought home in every sense of the word. As I walked out of the hospital facility onto the quiet, sunlit grounds of the base, the air felt clean and crisp against my skin. For 3 long years, I had fought 2 battles, one against the enemies in the field, and a far more exhausting one against the prejudice, arrogance, and quiet doubts of men who believed a woman didn't belong in their ranks. I hadn't proven my worth by shouting louder, acting tougher, or hiding my humanity. I had proven it by outthinking every bureaucrat who tried to destroy me, by standing unyielding in the face of absolute betrayal, and by ensuring that every single soldier who followed me into the dark walked back out alive. I stopped near the edge of the parade deck, looking out over the pine trees stretching toward the horizon. The uniform on my shoulders felt lighter now, stripped of the pain and anger that had burdened it for so long. My victory was complete, not because I had broken my enemy, but because I had reclaimed my dignity, protected my family, and earned a peace that no corrupt commander could ever take away from me again.